Some roads never let you leave, even when you think you've moved on decades ago. The story begins when Robert decided to take one final drive through his childhood hometown before relocating permanently to Oregon. At 39, he had spent the last 6 months meticulously planning his retirement from accounting, selling his modest suburban home, and preparing for what he called his fresh start. The drive through Millbrook County was meant to be a simple goodbye, a sentimental journey to see the old farmhouse, the elementary school, maybe the creek where he used to catch minnows with his bare hands. The morning air carried the scent of freshly turned earth and honeysuckle as Robert adjusted his rearview mirror and pulled on to Route 34. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of memory, flanked by the same weathered fence posts and sprawling oak trees that had watched over his childhood adventures. His Honda Civic hummed steadily beneath him, the radio playing soft classical music that seemed to harmonize with the gentle rolling of the countryside. Everything appeared exactly as he remembered. The faded red barn with its sagging roof, the hand-painted sign advertising fresh eggs that had been there for 20 years, the narrow bridge over Miller's Creek that always made him hold his breath as a child. Yet something felt subtly wrong. Robert couldn't pinpoint it at first, just a nagging sensation that the landscape was performing a carefully rehearsed play rather than simply existing. The paint on the barn looked too fresh for a structure he remembered as perpetually weathered. The egg sign displayed a phone number with an area code that hadn't been used in this region for over a decade. Most unsettling was the complete absence of other vehicles. No tractors, no pickup trucks, no school buses that should have been making their morning rounds. He slowed as he approached the Miller farm, where old Mrs. Miller used to wave from her kitchen window every time he walked to school. The house stood exactly as he remembered, down to the blue shutters and the ceramic rooster perched on the front steps. But Mrs. Miller had died 15 years ago, and her children had sold the property to developers. Robert distinctly remembered attending her funeral, yet there she was, or someone who looked exactly like her, standing at the kitchen window, raising her hand in the same welcoming gesture she had offered him countless times as a child. Robert pulled into the gravel driveway, his hands trembling slightly, as he realized the woman at the window was not just similar to Mrs. Miller. She was identical, down to the floral house dress and silver hair pinned in a neat bun, exactly as she had appeared 30 years ago. Robert sat in his car for several minutes, staring at the woman who could not possibly be Mrs. Miller. She continued waving from the window with the same patient smile he remembered, as if she had been waiting there for decades, specifically for his return. The rational part of his mind cataloged the impossibilities. Mrs. Miller would be well over 90 if she were alive. The house had been demolished for a shopping complex, and he had personally signed the guest book at her memorial service. Yet the evidence before his eyes suggested a different reality entirely. He stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady on the familiar gravel. The sound of his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around the property. The ceramic rooster on the steps appeared newly painted, its bright red comb gleaming in the morning sun. Even the wooden porch boards showed no signs of the rotten warping he remembered from his last visit here as a teenager. Everything had been preserved in a state of artificial perfection that made his skin crawl with unease. Mrs. Miller opened the front door before he could knock, her face lighting up with genuine delight. She looked exactly as she had when he was 8 years old. No additional wrinkles, no age spots, no tremor in her hands. Her voice carried the same warm cadence that had comforted him during countless afternoons when he sought refuge from playground bullies. She invited him in for lemonade and oatmeal cookies, mentioning details about his childhood that only the real Mrs. Miller could have known. His fear of the basement stairs, his collection of bottle caps, the way he always ate around the edges of his sandwiches first. The interior of the house matched his memories with disturbing precision. The same doilies covered the same end tables, the same photographs lined the mantelpiece, and the same grandfather clock ticked in the corner with its distinctive off-rhythm beat. Miller bustled around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, humming the hymn she always hummed while baking. She asked about his parents, his job, his plans for the future, questions that suggested she knew nothing of the 15 years that had passed since her death. Robert found himself answering automatically, falling into the comfortable rhythm of their old conversations while his mind raced to understand what was happening. The lemonade tasted exactly right, tart and sweet, with tiny pulp bits that caught between his teeth. The cookies were warm from the oven, filling the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. Every sensory detail confirmed the impossible reality that Mrs. Miller was alive, unchanged, and apparently unaware that time had moved forward without her. When Robert finally worked up the courage to mention that he was just visiting before moving away permanently, Mrs. Miller laughed softly and patted his hand, saying, "Oh, honey, you can't leave Millbrook. You've always lived here, and you always will." The words echoed in Robert's mind as he stared at Mrs. Miller's serene face. Her statement had been delivered with the casual certainty of someone commenting on the weather, yet it carried an undertone that made his stomach lurch. He attempted to explain that he had lived in Portland for over 20 years, that he had built a career there, that he owned property in a different state entirely. Mrs. Miller listened with the patient expression of an adult humoring a child's elaborate fantasy, nodding along while her eyes conveyed gentle disbelief. She guided him to the living room window and pointed toward the street, where his childhood home stood exactly as it had 3 decades ago. The yellow siding showed no signs of the fire damage that had forced his family to move when he was 12. The tire swing his father had hung from the oak tree swayed gently in a breeze that Robert couldn't feel. Most disturbing was the sight of a familiar figure mowing the front lawn, a man who looked exactly like his father, wearing the same red checkered shirt and work boots he had favored, appearing not a day older than when Robert had last seen him alive 15 years ago. Mrs. Miller's voice took on a soothing, almost hypnotic quality as she explained that Robert must have had a vivid dream about leaving Millbrook. Such dreams were common, she said, especially during times of stress or change. She reminded him of his job at the bank downtown, his volunteer work at the church, his weekly poker games with the other local men. With each detail she provided, Robert felt his memories shifting like sand, creating space for experiences he had never lived but that felt increasingly familiar. He tried to focus on concrete details from his real life, his apartment number in Portland, his ex-wife's maiden name, the scar on his hand from a kitchen accident last year. But these memories seemed to fade even as he grasped for them, becoming gossamer threads that dissolved under examination. Meanwhile, the false memories Mrs. Miller suggested grew stronger and more vivid. Sunday dinners at his parents' house, fishing trips to the local reservoir, a routine that had never varied because there had never been any need for it to vary. Through the window, Robert watched his father complete the lawn mowing and wave in their direction. The gesture was casual and familiar, as if he had seen Robert's car in Mrs. Miller's driveway hundreds of times before. Other neighbors began to emerge from their homes. The Peterson family, who had moved to Florida in 1995, old Mr. Jenkins, who had died in a nursing home, the Kowalski twins, who had been killed in Vietnam. All of them appeared exactly as they had during Robert's childhood, and all of them smiled and waved as if his presence was the most natural thing in the world. Robert realized, with growing horror, that he couldn't remember the address of his apartment in Portland, couldn't recall his ex-wife's face, Couldn't even remember why he had thought he needed to leave Millbrook in the first place, because according to every piece of evidence around him, he had never left at all. The realization hit Robert with the force of cold water. His entire adult life in Portland might be nothing more than an elaborate delusion. Mrs. Miller continued speaking in her gentle, matter-of-fact tone, describing his daily routine in Millbrook with such specific detail that his resistance began to crumble. She mentioned his morning walks to the bank, his favorite lunch spot at Della's Diner, his habit of stopping by the library every Tuesday evening. Each detail felt both foreign and familiar, like recovering from amnesia to discover a life he had forgotten living. Robert's hands shook as he reached for his wallet, desperate to find some tangible proof of his Portland existence. His driver's license showed a Millbrook address he didn't recognize, but that felt oddly correct. His credit cards bore the name of the local bank Mrs. Miller had mentioned. Most unsettling was a photograph tucked behind his license, a picture of himself standing in front of the same house he could see through the window, wearing clothes he didn't remember owning, smiling with a contentment he couldn't recall feeling. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed noon, its familiar off-rhythm bringing a flood of childhood comfort that overwhelmed his confusion. Mrs. Miller suggested he walk home for lunch, mentioning that his mother always worried when he was late for meals. The idea of his mother, dead for 8 years, waiting with a sandwich and soup, should have shattered the illusion entirely. Instead, Robert found himself nodding and thanking Mrs. Miller for the lemonade, his body moving with the automatic familiarity of someone following a routine performed thousands of times. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with gentle activity that felt both impossible and absolutely right. Children played in yards where no children should exist, their laughter carrying the same carefree quality he remembered from his own childhood summers. The mailman delivered letters to houses that had been demolished decades ago, whistling the same tune Robert's childhood mailman had favored. Every person he passed greeted him by name, asking about his day with the casual intimacy of lifelong neighbors. His father looked up from watering the garden as Robert approached the house, his face breaking into the warm smile that had been missing from Robert's life for 15 years. The sight should have been terrifying, a violation of everything Robert understood about death and time and the linear progression of existence. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey to a place where he had always belonged. His father mentioned that lunch was ready and asked about his visit with Mrs. Miller, as if this Tuesday was identical to every other Tuesday they had shared. Robert climbed the front steps of his childhood home, his hand automatically reaching for the doorknob with the loose grip he had learned to navigate as a boy. Through the screen door, he could smell his mother's vegetable soup and hear her humming in the kitchen. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about impossible situations and false realities, but that voice grew fainter with each step. As he crossed the threshold, Robert understood with crystalline clarity that some journeys home are only completed when you finally stop trying to leave. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and outside, his Honda Civic slowly faded from the driveway like morning mist, leaving no trace that he had ever lived anywhere else at all. Trust is the most dangerous thing a teacher can give, especially when the person asking for it wears a badge. The story begins when Jennifer Hudson loaded 12 excited third graders onto the yellow school bus for what should have been a routine field trip to the Natural History Museum in Springfield. At 31, she had chaperoned dozens of these excursions, always returning with tired but happy children, clutching souvenir pencils and talking non-stop about dinosaur bones. This Tuesday morning, felt no different as she checked her roster twice, counted heads 3 times, and made sure each child had their permission slips safely tucked into the folder on her lap. The October sky promised rain as Jennifer navigated the winding rural route that would take them around the construction delays on the main highway. Her students chattered excitedly behind her, trading snacks and playing word games she had taught them for long drives. Emma Rodriguez clutched her new lunchbox decorated with butterflies. Tommy Chen practiced writing his name in cursive on a fogged window. Sarah Kim shared her animal crackers with Marcus Wright, who had forgotten his snack again. Jennifer smiled as she listened to their voices, each child as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, after 3 months of patient teaching and gentle guidance. The storm struck with sudden ferocity around 10:30 a.m., transforming the moderate rainfall into a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. Jennifer pulled over beneath an overpass, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she waited for the worst to pass. Lightning illuminated the road in stark, terrifying flashes, and the children grew quiet with the instinctive fear that comes when nature displays its power. The radio crackled with weather warnings and reports of flash flooding in the low-lying areas they would need to cross. 20 minutes later, when the rain showed no signs of easing, Jennifer spotted a sign through the gloom. State Police Substation, mile marker 47. The building appeared like a beacon through the storm, its lights glowing warmly against the gray deluge. Jennifer had never seen this particular outpost before, but it looked official and safe, a single-story brick structure with the distinctive blue and gold emblem of the state police prominently displayed. Most importantly, it offered shelter for 12 frightened children and a teacher who was beginning to worry about flash floods and washed-out bridges. Officer Manning greeted them at the door with the kind of reassuring smile that Jennifer had learned to trust over years of working with law enforcement during school safety drills. He was tall and lean, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the calm demeanor that comes with decades of public service. His uniform was impeccably maintained, his badge polished to a mirror shine. He ushered them inside with genuine concern for their safety, explaining that the storm was expected to continue for several hours and that several roads had already been closed due to flooding. The children huddled together in the station's small waiting area, whispering nervously as Officer Manning locked the door behind them and explained with apologetic efficiency that standard safety protocols required the building to remain secure during severe weather emergencies. The lock clicked with a finality that made Jennifer's stomach tighten, though she couldn't articulate why. Officer Manning's explanation about security protocols sounded reasonable, even necessary given the severity of the storm raging outside. He offered hot chocolate from a small kitchenette and suggested the children might enjoy watching a nature documentary on the waiting room television while they rode out the weather. His voice carried the practiced authority that Jennifer had been conditioned to respect, yet something in his eyes lingered a fraction too long when he looked at each child. Jennifer began organizing her students into a comfortable seating arrangement, mentally taking attendance as she always did. Emma, Tommy, Sarah, Marcus, and 8 others, 12 bright faces looking to her for reassurance in this unfamiliar situation. Officer Manning returned with steaming mugs of cocoa that tasted oddly sweet, almost medicinal, but the children drank gratefully while thunder continued to shake the small building. Jennifer noticed that the officer's movements were precise and practiced, as if he had performed this exact routine many times before. The nature documentary played scenes of migrating birds while Officer Manning disappeared into a back office, leaving them alone in the waiting area. Jennifer tried to call the school to report their delay, but her cell phone showed no signal. The landline on the reception desk had been disconnected, its cord neatly coiled and stored in a drawer that Officer Manning had left partially open. When she asked about communication with the outside world, he explained that the storm had knocked out the phone lines and cell towers, leaving them completely isolated until repairs could be made. An hour passed, then 2. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, but Jennifer began to notice other things that didn't align with her expectations. The police station felt too quiet, too sterile, lacking the usual bustle of radio chatter and administrative activity she associated with law enforcement facilities. The walls displayed commendations and certificates, but the dates seemed wrong. Some appeared decades old, while others looked freshly printed. Most unsettling was the complete absence of other personnel. Officer Manning appeared to be the sole occupant of a facility that should have housed multiple officers and support staff. When Jennifer casually asked about the other officers, Manning explained that budget cuts had reduced the station to a single-person operation during certain shifts. His answer sounded rehearsed, delivered with the same calm professionalism he had maintained since their arrival. He suggested that she conduct a head count of her students to help pass the time, a reasonable request that made perfect sense for maintaining classroom order during an unusual situation. Jennifer looked around the room, mentally cataloging each child as she had done countless times before. Emma sat by the window. Tommy was sharing his coloring book with Sarah. Marcus had fallen asleep against the wall. She counted again, more carefully this time, pointing discreetly at each student. When she reached 11, Jennifer's blood turned to ice as she realized that one of her students was missing, though she couldn't remember which one. And when she mentioned this to Officer Manning, he looked at her with gentle confusion and asked, "Missing? But you've always had 11 children on this trip." Jennifer's mouth went dry as she stared at Officer Manning's placid expression. The certainty in his voice made her question her own memory, but she knew with absolute conviction that she had loaded 12 children onto that bus. She pulled out her attendance roster with trembling hands, scanning the list of names she had checked off that morning. The paper showed 11 names in her own handwriting, but she distinctly remembered writing 12. More disturbing was the growing realization that she couldn't identify which specific child was missing. The absent names seemed to slip from her mind like water through her fingers. She tried to recall the missing student by process of elimination, going through each child present and working backward to the one who wasn't there. Emma Rodriguez, with her butterfly lunchbox, sat curled in the corner chair. Tommy Chen continued practicing his cursive writing on the fogged window. Sarah Kim shared her remaining animal crackers with Marcus Wright, who was slowly waking from his nap. Jennifer could account for every face she saw, yet the mathematical impossibility remained. She had started with 12, and now had 11. Officer Manning watched her internal struggle with what appeared to be genuine concern, occasionally offering reassuring comments about how stressful situations could affect memory and perception. He suggested that perhaps the confusion stemmed from planning for 12 students, but only having 11 actually attend the trip, a reasonable explanation that should have provided comfort, but instead made Jennifer's skin crawl. His tone carried the patient condescension of an adult correcting a child's innocent mistake, and each gentle correction felt like another piece of her certainty being carefully removed. The children showed no signs of noticing any absence among their group. They interacted with the easy familiarity of classmates who had spent months together, with no gaps in their social dynamics or confused glances toward empty spaces. When Jennifer carefully asked if anyone remembered another student being with them that morning, they looked at her with the same gentle confusion that Officer Manning had displayed. Emma mentioned that there were 11 kids in their class. Tommy nodded in agreement, and Sarah asked if Miss Hudson was feeling okay, because she seemed worried about something. As afternoon faded toward evening, The storm outside intensified rather than diminishing. Officer Manning brought sandwiches from somewhere in the back of the building, explaining that emergency supplies were always kept on hand for situations exactly like this one. The food tasted fresh, despite supposedly being from emergency stores, and Jennifer noticed that he had prepared exactly 11 child-sized portions, plus 1 adult serving. When she asked about the precise count, he smiled and said he had been watching the children all day and naturally knew how many meals to prepare. Jennifer excused herself to use the restroom, desperate for a moment alone to collect her thoughts and make sense of the impossible situation. In the small bathroom mirror, she stared at her own reflection, trying to anchor herself to some immutable truth. She whispered the names of her students aloud, counting on her fingers as she went. But each time she reached 11. When she returned to the waiting area, she discovered that another child had vanished, and now there were only 10 students remaining, though Officer Manning calmly assured her that 10 had always been the correct number for this field trip. The pattern continued with horrifying precision as the hours passed. Each time Jennifer left the room to splash water on her face, to check the weather outside, to search for a working phone, another child would disappear from existence, not just from the room, but from reality itself, as if they had never been born. Her attendance sheet automatically updated itself, her memories restructured themselves, and Officer Manning's count always matched the diminishing number with unwavering accuracy. By 8 o'clock, only 7 children remained, though Jennifer's mind insisted that 7 had always been the correct number. Emma still clutched her butterfly lunchbox, but Jennifer could no longer remember why that detail had once seemed significant. Tommy continued writing in cursive, but the names he practiced were becoming fewer and fewer. The social dynamics among the remaining children shifted seamlessly to accommodate each absence, their friendships and interactions reorganizing themselves as if the missing students had never existed to fill those roles. Jennifer fought desperately to hold on to fragments of memory that were being systematically erased. She tried writing names on scraps of paper, but the words faded even as she watched. She attempted to photograph her students with her phone, but the images showed only the current count, with no evidence of the missing children. Most terrifyingly, she began to doubt her own memories, wondering if she had always been the kind of teacher who made careless mistakes with attendance and numbers. Officer Manning maintained his helpful demeanor throughout the evening, occasionally bringing snacks and drinks for the steadily decreasing group. He never acknowledged the disappearances because, from his perspective, nothing unusual was happening. When Jennifer became agitated and tried to confront him about the missing children, he responded with the patient concern of someone dealing with a person experiencing a mental health crisis. His suggestions that she might need medical attention felt both threatening and genuinely caring, delivered with the authority of someone trained to handle disturbed individuals. As the count dropped to 5, then 4, then 3, Jennifer realized with crystalline horror that she was witnessing something far worse than kidnapping or murder. The children weren't being taken. They were being unmade, erased from existence so completely that they had never been. No parents would call looking for them because those parents had never had those children. No school records would show their enrollment because they had never enrolled. The most perfect crime imaginable was being committed by someone who had found a way to edit reality itself. When only 2 children remained, Jennifer understood that she would be next. Officer Manning had been watching her with increasing focus, his helpful suggestions about her mental state becoming more insistent. She realized that her own existence was already beginning to fray around the edges, her memories of adult life growing fuzzy, her sense of identity shifting toward something smaller and more vulnerable. The terrible truth crystallized as she looked at the two remaining children. She wasn't their teacher anymore. She was another student, and she was about to discover what happened when the count reached 0. Officer Manning smiled kindly and suggested that perhaps it was time for everyone to go home, though of course there was no home to return to for people who had never existed. And as Jennifer felt her adult memories dissolving completely, she realized that some field trips never end. They simply erase themselves along with everyone who took them. Some roads remember everything, especially the moments when everything went wrong. The story begins when Michelle Carter found herself with no choice but to drive Route 9 for the first time in 15 years, the same stretch of asphalt where her family had died in a collision that should have taken her with them. The funeral for her grandmother was scheduled for 2 p.m., and a combination of bridge construction, flash flood warnings, and a multi-car accident on the interstate had closed every alternate route between her apartment in Denver and the small mountain town of Cedar Falls. Michelle sat in her Honda Accord at the entrance to Route 9, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The dashboard clock read 11:30 a.m., giving her just enough time to make the drive if she left immediately. She had spent 15 years carefully planning her life around avoiding this particular road, taking longer routes and enduring significant inconvenience to ensure she never had to face the curves and guardrails that haunted her dreams. The irony that her grandmother's final goodbye would force this confrontation felt like the universe playing a cruel joke. The morning air carried the scent of pine and approaching rain as Michelle finally pressed the accelerator and committed to the journey. Route 9 wound through the Rockies like a serpent, its narrow lanes hugging cliff faces and crossing ravines that dropped into shadowy valleys below. Every turn looked exactly as she remembered from that terrible night when she was 11 years old. The same weathered mile markers, the same wooden fence posts, the same guardrails that had failed to save her family when their car had skidded on black ice and tumbled into the ravine at mile 23. Michelle had been the only survivor, thrown clear during the first roll and found unconscious in a snowbank by the search and rescue team. The doctors called it a miracle. Her therapists called it survivor's guilt. Michelle called it the reason she became an emergency dispatcher, spending her adult life helping other people navigate crisis situations with calm precision and detailed knowledge of every back road, alternate route, and emergency service location in 3 counties. She had built her entire career around ensuring that other families wouldn't face the kind of helplessness her family had experienced on this very road. The radio played softly as she drove, familiar classic rock that should have provided comfort, but instead felt ominous in the confined space of the car. The weather report promised afternoon storms, with temperatures dropping and road conditions deteriorating after 1 p.m. Michelle calculated that she would reach the most dangerous section, mile 23, just before noon, giving her plenty of time to pay her respects and return before the weather turned nasty. It was a reasonable plan that accounted for every variable, except the possibility that some roads operate under different rules than the rest of the world. As Michelle approached mile marker 15, her radio began to emit static, and through the interference came a voice she recognized with blood-chilling certainty. Her father, calling for help and describing an accident that was happening right now, in real time, exactly as it had 15 years ago. Michelle's foot instinctively hit the brake as her father's voice crackled through the radio speakers with desperate clarity. He was describing their location at mile 23, reporting that their car had skidded on black ice and rolled down the embankment. His voice carried the same controlled panic she remembered from that night, the tone of a man trying to stay calm for his family while facing the unthinkable. He was asking for emergency services, giving detailed descriptions of injuries, pleading for someone to hurry because his wife wasn't responding and his son was bleeding badly. Michelle fumbled for the radio dial with shaking hands, trying to change stations, but her father's voice followed her across every frequency. M, FM, even the emergency channels she knew from her dispatcher training, all carried the same impossible transmission. Her father described the scene exactly as it had unfolded 15 years ago. Her mother unconscious with a head injury, her 8-year-old brother Danny trapped beneath twisted metal, and 11-year-old Michelle thrown clear but not responding to his calls. The timestamp he provided matched the exact time and date of the original accident, though the radio clock clearly showed today's date. She pulled over at mile 17, her heart hammering as she tried to process what was happening. Through her windshield, Michelle could see the familiar landmarks approaching, the sharp curve that her father had navigated successfully thousands of times, the guardrail that had been reinforced after the accident, the warning signs that had been installed in memory of her family. Yet her father's voice continued to describe events that had already happened, as if they were occurring in real time, rather than being broadcast from the past. Michelle reached for her cell phone to call her dispatcher colleagues, to report some kind of emergency radio malfunction or possible hoax. But when she looked at the screen, she found dozens of missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, along with text messages that made her blood freeze. The messages were from her mother, sent throughout the morning, asking where she was and why she hadn't come home from school. The texts described mundane details of family life, dinner plans, homework reminders, a note about Danny's soccer practice, as if the last 15 years had never happened. As she scrolled through the messages, Michelle realized they weren't just impossible communications from the dead. They were contextually perfect, referring to events and plans that had been interrupted by the accident. Her mother mentioned the science project Michelle had been working on, the library books that were due back, the permission slip for the field trip that Michelle would never take because the accident had changed everything. Each message felt authentic, in a way that suggested something far more complex than a cruel prank or technical malfunction. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Danny's voice, her little brother asking if anyone could hear him, reporting that he was hurt but that their dad was unconscious now and their mom still wasn't moving. His voice carried the bewildered fear of a child who didn't understand the magnitude of what was happening. Michelle looked at her odometer and realized with growing terror that she was approaching mile 23, the exact location where her family had died, and the voices on the radio were describing events that were happening right now, in present tense, as if the accident had never ended, but had been looping endlessly for 15 years, waiting for her to return. Michelle's hands trembled as she approached the fateful curve at mile 23, where the road bent sharply around a granite outcropping that had claimed countless vehicles over the decades. The voices on the radio grew more urgent and desperate, cycling through the same sequence of calls for help that she remembered from that horrible night. Her father would describe the accident, then fade into static. Her mother would briefly regain consciousness to ask about the children, then fall silent. Danny would cry for help until his voice grew weak. Then the cycle would begin again with her father's initial distress call, but this time, Michelle could see the scene unfolding through her windshield as she rounded the curve. There, at the bottom of the ravine, was her family's blue sedan. Not the rusted wreckage she had seen at the junkyard years later, but the car as it had been that night, steam rising from its crumpled hood, headlights still glowing weakly in the gathering darkness. Through the shattered windows, She could make out movement, shadows that suggested people trapped inside, calling for help that had never come in time. Michelle pulled over and stared down at the impossible scene. Every detail matched her memories and the police reports she had read obsessively as an adult. The car had rolled 3 times before coming to rest against a cluster of pine trees. The passenger side was completely crushed. The driver's door hung open at an odd angle, revealing her father slumped over the steering wheel. Most heartbreaking was the sight of her 11-year-old self lying motionless in the snow beside the wreckage, wearing the same purple winter coat she remembered, unconscious but breathing. The radio voices continued their desperate loop, but now Michelle could see that the timeline was wrong in a fundamental way. Her father was calling for help, describing injuries and requesting emergency services, but Michelle knew from her professional experience that no such calls had been received that night. The accident had been discovered hours later by a passing snowplow driver, too late to save anyone except the unconscious child who had been thrown clear. Yet here was evidence that her family had survived the initial impact, that they had lived long enough to call for help that never came. Michelle reached for her own radio, the professional-grade unit she always carried as an emergency dispatcher. She could contact the sheriff's department, request immediate rescue services, coordinate the helicopter that might be able to reach the ravine in time. She could change the outcome, save her family, prevent the trauma that had shaped her entire adult life. Her training kicked in automatically as she began to broadcast their location and situation, using the calm, precise language she had perfected through years of guiding other people through crisis situations. But as her voice echoed across the emergency frequencies, Michelle realized something that made her soul go cold. The timestamp on her radio showed the exact date and time of the original accident, not today's date, but November 15th, 15 years ago. She wasn't observing the scene from the present. She had somehow slipped backward in time to the moment when everything went wrong. Her professional dispatcher's voice crackled back to her through the radio static, and she heard herself, her adult self, responding to the emergency call with the devastating words, "No units available in that area due to the storm. Estimated response time is 3 hours," sealing her family's fate with her own voice. The terrible irony crashed over Michelle like an avalanche as she realized the truth. She had become part of the very system that had failed her family, and now she was watching herself, her adult, professional self, deliver the response that had condemned them to die in that ravine. The dispatcher's voice that echoed through the radio was unmistakably her own, seasoned by years of experience that wouldn't exist for another 15 years, yet somehow present at this crucial moment when every second mattered. Michelle grabbed the radio and tried to countermand her own response, shouting that units needed to be dispatched immediately, regardless of the storm conditions. But her words seemed to dissolve into static, unable to penetrate the closed loop of the original timeline. She could hear her family's voices growing weaker with each cycle, her father's calls becoming more desperate, her mother's brief periods of consciousness growing shorter. Danny's voice, once strong and clear, had developed a wet quality that Michelle recognized from her dispatcher training as a sign of internal bleeding. The adult Michelle, who existed as a voice on the radio, continued to follow standard protocols, explaining the storm situation and logging the incident with professional detachment. She could hear herself typing in the background, documenting the call with the same efficiency she had brought to thousands of similar situations. The dispatcher, herself, was doing everything correctly according to regulations and available resources, yet Michelle now understood that those protocols were insufficient for the unique conditions of that night. As she watched the scene below, Michelle began to understand the impossible mathematics of the situation. She had survived the accident as a child, grown up shaped by that trauma, become a dispatcher partly motivated by the desire to prevent similar tragedies, and ultimately found herself in a position to respond to her own family's emergency call across 15 years of time. The road had created a perfect circle, bringing her back to the moment when she might have saved them, if only she had made different choices about resource allocation and emergency priorities. The cycle was breaking down now, the voices on the radio growing fainter with each repetition. Michelle realized that the loop had been sustained by her own need to return to this moment, her unconscious desire to somehow change the outcome. But now that she understood her role in the original tragedy, the temporal echo was losing its power. Her family's car began to fade like morning mist, the voices growing distant and distorted, the entire scene becoming translucent and insubstantial. Michelle closed her eyes and made the hardest decision of her life. Instead of fighting the dissolution of the loop, she picked up her radio one final time and spoke directly to her younger self, the 11-year-old girl lying unconscious in the snow. She told her that the accident wasn't her fault, that she would grow up to help save other families, that the guilt and trauma would eventually transform into purpose and healing. She explained that some roads lead us back to where we started, so we can finally choose to move forward. When Michelle opened her eyes, she was sitting in her car at mile 23 in the present day, the ravine empty except for a small memorial plaque that bore her family's names, and her radio was broadcasting a simple message from her own dispatch center. Unit 47, you're clear to proceed to your destination. Your grandmother's service begins in 1 hour, and the roads ahead are safe. Some communities take hospitality so seriously that leaving becomes impossible. The story begins when Trevor Blackwood's BMW broke down on a rural highway 3 hours outside Denver, stranding him in a place that didn't appear on any modern map but felt disturbingly familiar nonetheless. At 35, Trevor had built his career on solving problems quickly and efficiently, turning struggling regional offices into profitable operations through strategic restructuring and modernized systems. This unscheduled detour to inspect a remote branch office should have been a simple day trip, but his car's engine had seized without warning on a stretch of road that seemed to exist outside normal geography. The breakdown occurred at the worst possible moment, just as storm clouds gathered on the horizon and his cell phone lost all signal. Trevor stood beside his disabled vehicle, designer suit already wilting in the humid air, watching as a hand-painted sign emerged from the approaching dusk. Welcome to Millfield, population AWOT 47, established 1892. The town materialized around the next bend, like something from a vintage postcard, complete with white picket fences, Victorian houses with wraparound porches, and gas lamps that flickered to life as darkness fell. Every building appeared freshly maintained, despite the antique architecture, as if the entire community existed in a bubble of preserved nostalgia. Trevor's first impression was of stepping into a Norman Rockwell painting that had somehow achieved three-dimensional reality. Children played hopscotch on sidewalks that showed no cracks or weeds. Elderly residents sat on porch swings that creaked in perfect rhythm. Garden beds burst with flowers that bloomed out of season, their colors impossibly vibrant in the fading light. The air carried the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that felt almost aggressive in its perfection. Within minutes of his arrival, a small crowd had gathered around Trevor and his stranded vehicle. The townspeople approached with the kind of eager helpfulness that he associated with small-town hospitality, though their smiles seemed rehearsed. and their questions oddly specific. They asked about his destination, his timeline, his family situation, and his work responsibilities with the practiced efficiency of people conducting an interview. When Trevor mentioned that he needed to reach the regional office by tomorrow morning, several residents exchanged meaningful glances and assured him that the local mechanic would have his car running perfectly, but not until the morning, at the earliest. Mayor Henderson, a portly man in his 60s wearing a vest and pocket watch that belonged to another century, stepped forward to personally welcome Trevor to Millfield. He explained that the town operated under traditional values of mutual assistance and community obligation, where visitors were treated as honored guests until they could complete their journeys. The mayor's speech felt like something delivered countless times before, polished by repetition until every word carried maximum emotional impact. He insisted that Trevor stay at the Millfield Inn, where a room was always kept ready for travelers in need. As the townspeople began to escort Trevor toward the inn with gentle but firm guidance, he noticed that every license plate in sight bore dates from decades past, and when he asked about this curious detail, Mayor Henderson smiled warmly and explained that Millfield had always been a place where time moved according to its own schedule, and that visitors often found their stays lasting much longer than originally planned. The explanation about time and extended stays should have raised immediate red flags, but the townspeople continued their gentle herding with such practiced efficiency that Trevor found himself inside the Millfield Inn before he could fully process the implications. The lobby felt like stepping into a museum exhibit dedicated to small-town America, complete with a grandfather clock that ticked with hypnotic regularity and oil paintings of pastoral scenes that seemed to watch visitors with unusual attention. Mrs. Caldwell, the innkeeper, had already prepared his room and insisted that payment could wait until his departure, whenever that might be. Trevor's accommodations were immaculate in a way that suggested obsessive attention to detail rather than simple cleanliness. Fresh flowers sat in a crystal vase that sparkled without a single water spot. The bed linens were pressed to crisp perfection and smelled of lavender. Most unsettling was the closet, which contained a complete wardrobe in his exact size, casual clothes that looked handmade and perfectly suited to small-town life. Mrs. Caldwell explained that the inn maintained clothing for guests who might find their stays extended by unexpected circumstances, and that many visitors discovered they preferred the simpler attire to their original traveling clothes. Dinner was served in the inn's dining room at precisely 6 o'clock. Though Trevor hadn't been aware of making a reservation, the other guests were a diverse collection of people who all claimed to be passing through Millfield on various business trips, family visits, and vacation excursions. Each had been stranded by different circumstances: car trouble, missed connections, sudden illness, and each had been welcomed by the community with the same overwhelming hospitality. What disturbed Trevor was how comfortable they all seemed with their indefinite stays, discussing local events and community traditions as if they had lived in Millfield for years rather than days or weeks. During the meal, Mayor Henderson joined their table to explain Millfield's unique approach to visitor relations. The town operated on a philosophy of reciprocal community service, where guests contributed their skills and expertise to local projects while enjoying the community's protection and support. Trevor's background in business optimization would be invaluable in helping the town modernize certain operations, while other guests had provided their own specialized knowledge in areas ranging from healthcare to education to agricultural planning. The arrangement seemed perfectly reasonable, almost generous in its mutual benefit. Trevor attempted to call his office using the inn's landline, but the operator informed him that long-distance service had been temporarily suspended due to storm damage. His request to borrow a car or arrange alternative transportation were met with apologetic explanations about insurance liability and the dangerous condition of the roads following recent weather. Every practical solution he proposed was gently deflected with legitimate-sounding concerns that left him feeling unreasonable for insisting on immediate departure when the community was offering such generous assistance. As the evening progressed and Trevor found himself agreeing to help with a minor business consultation the following morning, he began to notice that every guest at the inn wore the same subtle expression of contentment mixed with resignation, and that when he looked out his window at the town square, he could see other visitors from previous nights walking slowly through the streets, their expensive city clothes replaced by simple local attire, their faces bearing the same peaceful emptiness of people who had stopped trying to leave. Trevor spent the night in a state of uneasy vigilance, unable to shake the feeling that his situation was far more precarious than the townspeople's friendly demeanor suggested. He had noticed too many small details that didn't align with normal small-town hospitality. The way conversations stopped when he approached groups of locals, the methodical nature of their questions about his background and connections, and most disturbing, the gradual transformation he observed in long-term guests who seemed to have forgotten their original reasons for traveling through Millfield. The next morning brought fresh complications disguised as helpful assistance. The mechanic, a cheerful man named Pete, who wore coveralls that looked freshly pressed, despite his supposedly dirty work, explained that Trevor's car needed a specialized part that would take several days to arrive. The BMW's engine had suffered what Pete described as a complete timing chain failure, though Trevor distinctly remembered having the car serviced just weeks earlier. Pete's diagnosis was delivered with the practiced authority of someone who had explained similar mechanical failures countless times before, always requiring parts that took exactly the right amount of time to arrive. Mayor Henderson appeared at the garage just as Pete finished his explanation, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone bearing good news. He had spoken with the town council about Trevor's business expertise, and they were unanimous in their excitement about having such a qualified consultant available to help with their economic development initiatives. The project would take only a few days to complete, perfectly coinciding with the time needed for car repairs, and the compensation would more than cover Trevor's accommodation costs, plus a generous honorarium for his professional services. The work itself seemed legitimate and even engaging, analyzing the town's revenue streams, identifying opportunities for sustainable growth, developing strategies for attracting appropriate businesses that would complement Millfield's traditional values. Trevor found himself genuinely impressed by the community's financial stability and their thoughtful approach to development. Every resident seemed to have a specific role that contributed to the town's overall prosperity, and their coordination suggested decades of successful collaboration. The only odd element was their complete lack of interest in modern technology or external partnerships that might increase their efficiency or market reach. As Trevor delved deeper into Millfield's economic structure, he discovered that the town's prosperity was based on a unique combination of traditional crafts, agricultural products, and what the mayor euphemistically called hospitality services. The books showed steady revenue from sources that weren't entirely clear, and when Trevor asked for clarification, he was told that some aspects of the town's business model were proprietary and would be explained once he had completed his initial assessment. The evasive answers triggered his professional instincts, but every time he pressed for details, the conversation was redirected with such smooth skill that he found himself accepting the delays. By the third day, Trevor realized that he was participating in a carefully orchestrated process designed to gradually increase his investment in the community. Each morning brought new complications with his car repair. Each afternoon introduced additional consulting responsibilities, and each evening featured social events that highlighted Millfield's warmth and stability. When he finally demanded to leave immediately, regardless of his car's condition, Trevor discovered that every road leading out of town was blocked by construction barriers that the workers insisted had been in place for months, though he was certain they hadn't existed when he arrived. The construction barriers were substantial and professional, complete with orange cones, warning signs, and official-looking permits that bore the seals of highway departments Trevor had never heard of. The work crews manning these roadblocks were polite but inflexible, explaining that major infrastructure repairs would keep all routes closed for an indefinite period. They showed Trevor detailed project timelines and environmental impact assessments that would have been impressive in their thoroughness if not for the fact that he was certain these barriers hadn't existed when he arrived in Millfield just 3 days earlier. Trevor's attempts to contact outside authorities were met with the same systematic obstacles that had frustrated his earlier communication efforts. Phone lines remained mysteriously compromised, internet service was unavailable due to ongoing technical difficulties, and the town's isolation seemed to extend far beyond simple geographical remoteness. When he demanded to speak with state police or federal authorities, Mayor Henderson expressed genuine confusion about why Trevor would want to involve outside agencies in what was clearly a local matter that could be resolved through community cooperation and patience. As days turned into weeks, Trevor watched other trapped visitors undergo a subtle but unmistakable transformation. Their initial frustration and demands for immediate departure gradually softened into acceptance and eventual contentment with Millfield's rhythm of life. The businessman who had arrived the week before, Trevor now spoke enthusiastically about the town's traditional values and his own growing appreciation for simpler pleasures. The woman who had been desperately trying to reach her daughter's wedding was now planning to invite her family to visit Millfield instead, convinced that they would love the peaceful atmosphere. Trevor recognized the pattern because he could feel it beginning to affect his own thinking. The town's relentless kindness and his forced participation in community activities were creating genuine bonds that made the idea of leaving feel increasingly abstract and unnecessary. His consulting work had evolved into a comprehensive economic development plan that would take months to implement properly. The townspeople had begun treating him as a permanent resident, including him in long-term planning discussions and introducing him to local traditions that supposedly required years to understand fully. The breaking point came when Trevor discovered the town's actual source of prosperity during a late-night exploration of the municipal building. Hidden in the basement were detailed records of Millfield's hospitality program, dating back over a century. The files contained photographs and biographical information for hundreds of travelers who had been welcomed into the community under circumstances identical to Trevor's experience. Each case followed the same pattern: mechanical breakdown or transportation failure, overwhelming hospitality, gradual integration into town life, and eventual permanent residency that was documented with disturbing bureaucratic precision. The photographs showed visitors from every era of American history, their clothing and vehicles changing with the decades, while the town remained remarkably consistent. Most chilling were the before and after pictures that documented each person's transformation from frustrated traveler to contented resident. The final photograph in each file showed the same expression Trevor had noticed in long-term guests, a peaceful emptiness that suggested not just acceptance, but the complete absence of any desire to be anywhere else. Trevor realized with crystal clarity that Millfield didn't just trap travelers with mechanical barriers and social pressure. It systematically rewired their fundamental desires and motivations until leaving became not just impossible, but literally unthinkable. and as he closed the filing cabinet, he could feel his own desperate need to escape, already beginning to fade into something that felt disturbingly like gratitude for the community's endless, suffocating kindness. Some debts can only be paid with pieces of yourself, and the interest compounds in ways that defy mathematics. The story begins when Marcus Wheeler accepted a midnight delivery route through unfamiliar rural highways, desperate to earn the extra money that might finally satisfy the men who had been calling him with increasing frequency about his gambling debts. At 42, Marcus had watched his construction career crumble along with his knee ligaments, leaving him with a truck driver's license and the kind of desperation that makes dangerous choices seem reasonable. The cargo manifest listed engine parts, destined for a warehouse in Carson City, a straightforward run that should have netted him enough overtime pay to make a significant dent in the $10,000 he owed to people who didn't negotiate payment plans. Marcus had volunteered for the route specifically because it offered night differential pay and hazard compensation for driving through mountain passes during winter weather. What he hadn't anticipated was the GPS routing him onto roads that didn't appear on any official map, through territory that felt increasingly isolated with each mile. Road 86 cut through dense forest and rolling hills that seemed to swallow his headlights, creating a tunnel of illumination that revealed only the next few yards of cracked asphalt. The radio picked up nothing but static, and his cell phone had lost signal shortly after he left the main highway. Marcus told himself that the isolation was temporary, that he would emerge onto familiar roads within the hour, but the mile markers he passed showed numbers that didn't correspond to any highway system he knew. The toll booth appeared without warning, materializing from the darkness like something that had always been there but had chosen this moment to reveal itself. It stood squarely in the center of the road, a weathered wooden structure with yellowed glass and hand-painted signs that looked decades old. The booth was clearly abandoned. No lights, no movement, no indication that anyone had operated it in years. Yet the crossing arm was down, blocking the road with the finality of a gate that had never been opened for free passage. Marcus slowed his truck to a stop and stared at the obstacle. The logical response would be to turn around and find an alternate route, but he was already behind schedule and couldn't afford the fuel costs of backtracking through the mountain passes. The toll booth looked fragile enough that his truck could push through the crossing arm without significant damage, and there was obviously no one present to collect payment or report the violation. It seemed like a reasonable risk for someone who had already committed to a night of questionable decisions. As Marcus shifted into gear and prepared to ram through the barrier, a figure slowly rose from inside the supposedly empty booth, tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned toll collector's uniform that was charred and tattered, as if it had survived a fire that had consumed everything except the man wearing it. The figure inside the booth moved with deliberate, mechanical precision, turning toward Marcus's truck, as if sensing his presence through supernatural awareness rather than ordinary sight. The toll collector's uniform hung loose on his skeletal frame, revealing burned flesh beneath fabric that should have disintegrated decades ago. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a cap that bore the same scorch marks as the rest of his clothing. But Marcus could see enough detail to understand that this man had died in flames and somehow continued working his post long after the fire had claimed him. A metal drawer extended from the booth with a grinding shriek that cut through the engine noise and settled into Marcus's bones like a physical weight. The toll collector stood motionless behind the glass, waiting with the patience of someone who had collected payment from countless travelers and had learned that everyone eventually paid what they owed. The drawer remained open, empty, expectant. A hand-painted sign became visible in the booth's window. toll must be paid, no exceptions. Marcus sat frozen in his truck, logic warring with the evidence before his eyes. Dead men didn't operate toll booths. Abandoned structures didn't suddenly spring to life with supernatural collectors demanding payment. Yet the figure behind the glass was undeniably present, undeniably waiting, and undeniably capable of preventing Marcus's passage until some form of tribute was offered. The practical part of his mind suggested coins from his cup holder, loose bills from his wallet, anything that might satisfy whatever bizarre mechanism was operating this impossible checkpoint. He rolled down his window and leaned out, fishing for change, while keeping his eyes on the toll collector. The air that wafted from the booth carried the acrid scent of burned wood and something else, something organic and terrible that suggested flesh that had never properly healed from fire damage. Marcus dropped a handful of quarters and dimes into the metal drawer, hoping that loose change would be sufficient to satisfy whatever system governed this nightmare encounter. The coins rattled in the drawer for a moment before disappearing into the booth's interior with a sound like pebbles falling into a deep well. The toll collector examined the payment with movements that suggested profound dissatisfaction. After several seconds of silent evaluation, he shook his head with slow, deliberate negation. The drawer extended again, still empty, still waiting. The message was clear. The payment had been insufficient, and something more substantial would be required before the crossing arm would rise. Marcus reached for his wallet, but before he could extract any bills, the truck's dashboard began to emit a soft chiming sound, and items from his personal collection started appearing in the toll drawer without his knowledge or consent. First his father's old wristwatch, then his wedding ring from his failed marriage, then a photograph of his daughter that he kept tucked behind his driver's license. The appearance of his personal belongings in the toll drawer sent ice through Marcus's veins as he realized that this entity wasn't simply demanding payment. It was conducting a thorough inventory of everything he valued and systematically extracting items that carried emotional significance. His father's watch had been in his glove compartment, safely locked away since the funeral 3 years ago. His ex-wife's ring lived in a small box buried beneath work clothes in his apartment. The photograph of his daughter existed only in his wallet, behind 2 credit cards and his commercial driver's license. Each item materialized in the drawer with the casual impossibility of magic performed by something that operated outside normal physical laws. The toll collector examined each offering with the methodical attention of an appraiser, weighing their emotional value against some internal calculation that Marcus couldn't begin to understand. The watch disappeared into the booth's darkness with a sound like breaking glass. The ring followed with a soft whisper that might have been wind, or might have been his ex-wife's voice saying goodbye. But the photograph remained in the drawer, apparently insufficient to cover whatever debt was being assessed. Marcus found himself speaking to the toll collector, trying to negotiate terms he didn't understand for a transaction that shouldn't exist. He explained his financial situation, his delivery deadline, his need to reach Carson City before dawn. The burned figure listened with the same patient attention he had given to examining the offered payments, but showed no signs of comprehension or sympathy. This was not a negotiation between 2 rational parties. It was an assessment being conducted by something that evaluated worth according to criteria that had nothing to do with money or time or human convenience. The drawer extended again, and this time Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. When he looked down at his hands, his left pinky fingernail was simply gone, not torn off or broken, but absent as if it had never existed. There was no pain, no blood, no indication that anything had been removed. Yet Marcus knew with absolute certainty that the toll collector had taken something that belonged to him, something that could never be replaced or regenerated. The price was escalating beyond monetary payment into territory that involved pieces of his physical being. Panic finally broke through his paralysis, and Marcus threw the truck into reverse, desperate to escape whatever malevolent force was operating this impossible checkpoint. But the road behind him had changed during his encounter with the toll collector. Instead of the forest highway he had traveled, Marcus found himself facing an identical toll booth, with the same burned figure waiting patiently for payment. The road had somehow become a loop that led back to the same supernatural transaction, offering no escape route for travelers who had accrued debts that transcended ordinary currency. Marcus realized with growing horror that he was trapped in a closed circuit designed specifically for people like him. People who had borrowed against their futures and were now being called upon to pay with interest that compounded in ways that violated every natural law. And as he looked at his reflection in the truck's mirror, he saw that his left ear was missing entirely, taken as payment for attempting to flee without settling his account. The disappearance of his ear confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the nature of his predicament. He was caught in a supernatural payment system that operated on principles far more sinister than any loan shark or collection agency he had ever encountered. Each attempt to evade or negotiate resulted in the toll collector extracting increasingly significant pieces of his identity and physical being. The debt wasn't being paid with money. It was being settled through the systematic dismantling of everything that made Marcus himself. As he sat trapped between identical toll booths that defied the laws of geography and physics, Marcus began to understand the true scope of his situation. The road had become a closed loop, specifically designed to contain debtors until their obligations were fully satisfied. Other vehicles began to appear in his rearview mirror, cars and trucks from different eras, their drivers visible through windows as shadowy figures who had learned to accept their circumstances. Some vehicles looked decades old, suggesting that certain debts required extended payment periods that stretched far beyond normal human lifespans. The toll collector continued his methodical extraction of payment, taking memories along with physical attributes. Marcus found himself unable to recall his daughter's middle name, then couldn't remember the sound of his ex-wife's laugh, then lost entirely the memory of his first day working construction. Each missing piece left a void that he could perceive but couldn't fill, like trying to remember a word that hovered just beyond mental reach. The toll collector seemed particularly interested in memories associated with happiness and accomplishment, as if positive experiences carried higher value in whatever economy governed this nightmare. Marcus's desperate attempts to satisfy the debt by offering everything he could think of, his truck, his tools, his remaining possessions, were met with the same patient indifference the toll collector had shown toward his initial coins. The entity was following a precise algorithm that valued items according to their emotional significance and personal connection, rather than their monetary worth. A photograph of his first paycheck proved more valuable than his expensive watch. A letter from his daughter meant more than his truck's title. The debt was being calculated in units of sentiment and identity, rather than dollars and cents. As dawn approached, Marcus realized that the payment process was nearing completion. Most of his memories had been extracted, leaving him with only fragmentary recollections of a life that felt increasingly distant and unreal. His physical form had been reduced to essential components, missing features and attributes that the toll collector had deemed expendable. Yet some core element of his being remained intact, suggesting that the process had a specific endpoint rather than continuing until nothing remained. The crossing arm finally began to rise with a grinding mechanical sound that seemed to echo from decades of similar transactions. The toll collector stepped aside with a gesture that might have been courtesy or dismissal. allowing Marcus passage to whatever destination awaited beyond the booth. But as his truck rolled forward into the morning light, Marcus understood that he was no longer the same person who had approached this checkpoint hours earlier. The road ahead stretched into familiar territory that looked exactly like the route to Carson City, but Marcus knew with crystalline certainty that he would never arrive at his intended destination, because the man who had accepted that delivery job no longer existed, and the entity who had taken his place was something far simpler, far more compliant, and infinitely more grateful for the opportunity to serve whatever purpose the toll collector's masters had in mind. Sometimes the shortest distance between 2 points is a road that doesn't exist on any map, and those roads have their own rules about who gets to leave. The story begins when Melissa Foster decided to trust her GPS over her own instincts, taking what appeared to be a simple detour around highway construction that would save her 40 minutes of stop-and-go traffic. At 28, Melissa had built her sales career on punctuality and preparation, maintaining meticulous schedules that allowed her to visit rural clients across 3 states while never missing a deadline or appointment. The alternative route looked straightforward on her phone's navigation system, a clean blue line that curved through countryside she had never explored, connecting back to the main highway just past the construction zone. Her afternoon appointment in Riverside was crucial for meeting her quarterly targets, and the detour promised to deliver her there with time to spare for the kind of thorough preparation that had made her one of the company's top regional representatives. The rural roads would be a pleasant change from interstate driving, offering scenery and solitude that might help her mentally rehearse her presentation. The detour began exactly as expected, with well-maintained asphalt, winding through farmland, and scattered woodlots that looked like postcards from an idealized vision of rural America. Melissa relaxed into the drive, enjoying the absence of heavy traffic and the gentle curves that required just enough attention to keep her alert without creating stress. Her GPS continued to provide confident directions, announcing upcoming turns with the same mechanical precision that had guided her through hundreds of successful business trips. But the road signs began to display names that didn't correspond to anything on her written maps or in her mental catalog of regional geography. Millbrook, 15 miles, appeared on a green highway marker that looked official and properly maintained. Yet Millbrook wasn't listed in any of her reference materials. Entering Clearview Township, announced another sign. Though Clearview didn't appear on any county map she had studied, each unfamiliar destination was presented with the same authoritative formatting that marked legitimate municipal boundaries, creating a subtle dissonance between her expectations and the evidence passing outside her windows. Melissa's first instinct was to dismiss the discrepancy as a simple gap in her knowledge of this particular region. Rural areas often contained small communities that didn't appear on major commercial maps, and her sales territory was vast enough that she couldn't possibly be familiar with every minor settlement. The GPS continued to indicate that she was following the correct route, with her estimated arrival time remaining constant despite the unfamiliar landmarks. There was no logical reason to doubt the technology that had never failed her before. When Melissa decided to pull over and consult her backup paper map for confirmation, she discovered that the road she was currently driving didn't exist according to any of her reference materials. And when she looked back the way she had come, the familiar landscape she had just passed through was nowhere to be seen. Only an endless stretch of identical rural highway, extending in both directions with no visible beginning or end. Melissa's hands shook as she spread her collection of paper maps across the hood of her car, searching desperately for any indication of her current location. Every route she had memorized, Every landmark she recognized, every highway number that should have guided her back to familiar territory, had simply vanished. The road beneath her feet was real enough. Solid asphalt with painted yellow lines and properly installed guardrails. Yet it existed in a geographical void that defied every navigation tool she possessed. Her GPS screen showed her position as a blue dot moving along a clearly defined route, complete with street names and directional indicators that suggested she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But when Melissa zoomed out to see the broader context, the surrounding area appeared as a blank gray expanse, with no connecting roads, no neighboring towns, and no reference points that corresponded to actual geography. The device was tracking her movement along a route that existed only within its digital memory, disconnected from the real world in ways that should have been impossible. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full when she had started the detour, but now hovered just above the halfway mark, despite traveling for what felt like less than an hour. More unsettling was the odometer, which displayed numbers that didn't match her mental calculations of distance traveled. Either her perceptions of time and space had become fundamentally unreliable, or the road itself operated according to different physical laws than the rest of the universe. Neither explanation offered much comfort to someone whose livelihood depended on precise scheduling and accurate navigation. Melissa climbed back into her car and attempted to reverse course, hoping to retrace her route back to the highway construction that had prompted this detour. But the road behind her looked different now. The same basic configuration of asphalt and lane markings, but with subtle alterations in the surrounding landscape that suggested she was no longer traveling the same path. Farmhouses appeared where she remembered seeing open fields. A red barn stood where she distinctly recalled passing a grain silo. Even the trees seemed rearranged, as if someone had been editing the scenery during her brief stop to consult the maps. The most disturbing change was in the road signs, which now displayed completely different information than what she had observed during her initial passage. Riverside, 23 miles, appeared on a marker that had previously indicated a different destination entirely. Her GPS adjusted accordingly, recalculating her route to accommodate the new information while maintaining the same estimated arrival time. The technology was adapting to changes in reality with an efficiency that suggested this kind of geographical flexibility was a normal feature rather than an impossible anomaly. As Melissa drove deeper into the impossibly shifting landscape, she began to notice other vehicles sharing the road. Cars and trucks that appeared and disappeared without following normal traffic patterns. Their drivers visible as shadowy figures who seemed to be navigating the same endlessly changing route with the resigned patience of people who had long since stopped expecting to reach their original destinations. The other vehicles on the road followed no discernible traffic patterns, appearing in Melissa's rearview mirror without having been visible moments before, then vanishing around curves that led nowhere, or simply fading from sight while still supposedly within view. She tried to make eye contact with other drivers at the few intersections she encountered, but their faces remained obscured by shadows that seemed too deep for the available lighting conditions. Their vehicles looked normal enough. Sedans, pickup trucks, SUVs from various decades, but they moved with the mechanical precision of people following predetermined routes rather than making conscious navigation decisions. Melissa began to experiment with the road's apparent mutability, deliberately taking turns that her GPS hadn't suggested and observing how the landscape adapted to accommodate her choices. Left turns that should have led to dead ends somehow connected to new stretches of highway. Right turns that appeared to circle back to her starting position instead opened onto entirely different rural vistas. The road seemed to anticipate her decisions and generate appropriate continuations, creating an infinite network of possibilities that all looked authentically rural, while leading absolutely nowhere. Her fuel gauge had become completely unreliable, sometimes showing nearly empty after short drives, other times displaying a full tank, despite hours of continuous travel. The dashboard clock flickered between different times with no apparent pattern, occasionally jumping backward or forward by hours, making it impossible to track how long she had been trapped in this impossible geography. Her phone's battery level showed similar inconsistencies, draining rapidly during some periods while remaining static during others, as if the road itself was drawing power from her devices according to its own mysterious requirements. The most unnerving discovery came when Melissa realized she was beginning to recognize landmarks she had never seen before. A weathered barn with a distinctive curved roof became familiar after passing it multiple times, though she was certain she had never taken the same route twice. A small cemetery with tilted headstones felt like a place she had visited regularly, despite having no memory of stopping there. Her mind was adapting to the road's impossible geography by creating false memories of familiarity, making the endless journey feel like a homecoming rather than a trap. She tried using her cell phone to call for help, but discovered that while the device showed full signal strength, every number she dialed connected to the same automated message. The number you have reached is not currently accessible from your location. Please adjust your route and try again. The message was delivered in her own voice, as if she had recorded it herself at some point, though she had no memory of doing so. Even emergency services responded with the same recording, suggesting that the road had completely severed her connection to the outside world. As darkness began to fall, and her headlights illuminated the same stretches of highway she had been traveling all day, Melissa finally understood that she wasn't lost in any conventional sense. She had become part of the road itself, joining an endless circulation of travelers who had traded their destinations for the illusion of perpetual progress toward places that existed only as long as someone was driving toward them. The realization that she had become part of the road's endless circulation brought with it a strange sense of relief that terrified Melissa more than the initial confusion had. Her desperate need to reach Riverside, to make her appointment, to maintain her perfect sales record. All of these concerns were fading into abstract concepts that belonged to someone else's life. The road was systematically erasing her external obligations and replacing them with the simple, hypnotic rhythm of driving without destination or purpose, beyond the act of movement itself. Melissa found herself making fewer attempts to escape or find alternate routes, instead settling into the comfortable routine of following whatever path appeared before her. The landscape had stabilized into a pleasant pastoral loop that felt familiar and safe, populated by the same weathered barns, rolling hills, and distant farmhouses that created an atmosphere of timeless rural tranquility. Her earlier panic about being lost was being replaced by a growing appreciation for the road's protection from the stresses and demands of her former life. Other drivers had begun acknowledging her presence with subtle nods and gestures that suggested welcome rather than shared distress. When she passed the same vehicles repeatedly, their occupants would wave with the casual friendliness of neighbors greeting each other during daily routines. The shadowy quality of their faces had resolved into expressions of contentment and acceptance that reflected her own evolving attitude toward their shared situation. They were no longer trapped travelers, but willing participants in a community that existed solely in motion. Her car had adapted to the road's requirements with mechanical changes that should have been impossible. The fuel gauge now showed a constant 3/4 full, ensuring that she would never be stranded, but never have enough fuel to attempt a truly long journey. The speedometer had locked at a steady 45 miles per hour, fast enough to feel like progress, but slow enough to appreciate the scenery and maintain the peaceful atmosphere. Even her phone had evolved, now displaying only a map of the road network she was traveling, with her appointment calendar replaced by a simple clock that showed whatever time felt most appropriate for the current lighting conditions. Melissa's last conscious attempt to break free came when she spotted what appeared to be a gas station in the distance, offering the possibility of contact with the outside world. But as she drove toward it, the building remained perpetually ahead of her, always visible, but never reachable, like a mirage that maintained just enough distance to prevent investigation. She understood then that the road would provide everything necessary for survival, but nothing that might facilitate escape. It was a perfect prison that felt exactly like freedom to anyone who had learned to stop wanting anything beyond its boundaries. As Melissa settled into her new existence, she felt the last remnants of her former identity dissolving into the rhythm of endless travel. Her sales appointments, her quarterly targets, her carefully maintained schedule. All of these belonged to a woman who had once been trapped by external expectations and artificial deadlines. The road had liberated her from the exhausting pursuit of destinations that had never really mattered. And as her car joined the eternal procession of vehicles traveling nowhere in particular, Melissa finally understood that some journeys are completed not by arriving somewhere, but by learning to stop needing to arrive at all. And with that, their stories came to an end, leaving only one question to haunt you. If you discovered that every shortcut you've ever taken was actually leading you toward the very thing you were trying to avoid, would you still have the courage to choose the difficult path? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read all of them. See you in the next one.